Am I the asshole for building a separate life and eventually divorcing my wife after she declared I dictate when we have sex, citing her feminist beliefs and shutting down all communication? Throw away for reals because this is way too personal, and I still have mutual friends with my ex. So, yeah, the title pretty much lays it all out, but trust me, there are layers upon layers of awkward, frustrating, and ultimately heartbreaking context to unpack here. I'm Mark, now 37M, and my 6-year marriage to Sarah ended about a year ago. Looking back, the cracks started forming subtly, like hairline fractures in a seemingly solid foundation. We had our initial spark, the honeymoon phase where everything felt easy and exciting. We built a life together, a comfortable routine, the shared inside jokes and the assumption of a future. But then, around our 3rd anniversary, the dynamic shifted, and not in a healthy way. I remember the exact moment it happened. We were winding down after dinner, just chatting about our days. Sarah was usually quite vocal about her beliefs, her passion for social justice, and her strong feminist stance. I always admired her conviction, even if we didn't always see eye to eye on every single issue. But this particular evening, her pronouncement felt less like a philosophical discussion and more like a gauntlet thrown down. "Mark," she said, her tone leaving no room for debate, "I've been doing a lot of thinking about the power dynamics in our relationship, particularly around intimacy. From now on, I will be the one who dictates when we have sex." The reasoning that followed was a dense monologue about dismantling patriarchal norms within marriage, reclaiming her bodily autonomy, and rejecting the male gaze that she felt permeated even our private moments. Now, I want to be clear, I've always believed in equality. I've always tried to be a supportive and respectful partner. But this felt different. It wasn't a conversation about mutual desires and boundaries, it was a unilateral declaration that immediately made me feel like my own desires and needs were irrelevant. It felt like I had been demoted from partner to supplicant. The immediate aftermath was a confusing blur of disbelief and hurt. I tried to articulate how this made me feel, how it created a sense of distance and powerlessness. I wasn't demanding sex on a schedule, I simply wanted a sense of mutual desire and connection. But every attempt to discuss it was met with a wall of intellectualized arguments and accusations of me being entitled, unwilling to understand basic feminist principles, or even emotionally manipulative for expressing my feelings of alienation. It was like trying to argue with a brick wall that was quoting Simone de Beauvoir. The lack of intimacy wasn't just about the physical act itself. It seeped into every corner of our relationship. The casual touches lessened, the goodnight kisses felt perfunctory, and the unspoken language of desire that had once flowed between us dried up. I started feeling like I was living with a very articulate and politically aware roommate who I occasionally shared a bed with, under her strictly defined terms. I pleaded with her to consider couples counseling. I genuinely believed that a neutral third party could help us navigate this incredibly sensitive issue and find a way to communicate effectively. But Sarah was vehemently against it. "Therapy is a bourgeois construct designed to pathologize normal emotional responses," she'd declare, "or why would I need some stranger to tell me how to live my life or my marriage?" It felt like she was more invested in her ideological stance than in the actual health and well-being of our relationship. The constant rejection and the feeling of being completely unheard started to take a serious toll on my mental and emotional state. It wasn't a sudden explosion of anger, it was a slow, insidious erosion of connection. I started to feel like my feelings didn't matter, that my needs were inherently less valid. It was a lonely and isolating experience, living under the same roof as someone who felt so ideologically opposed to my basic human desires for intimacy and connection. In response, almost unconsciously, I began to withdraw. It wasn't a deliberate act of passive aggression, but more of a self-preservation mechanism kicking in. I started focusing on aspects of my life where I felt a sense of agency and control. My health had always been something I'd neglected, so I joined a gym and started working out regularly. The physical exertion became a way to channel my frustration, and the endorphins offered a small respite from the emotional weight I was carrying. I also started paying more attention to my diet, focusing on nourishing my body in a way that felt empowering. Photography, my old passion from my college days, became a lifeline. I dug out my dusty equipment, started going on solo photo walks around the city, and rediscovered the joy of capturing moments and creating art. It was a world where I could express myself without the need for verbal communication or the fear of ideological rebuttal. My confidence started to slowly rebuild as I saw tangible progress in my fitness and my creative pursuits. At work, I threw myself into projects with a renewed intensity. Maybe it was a way to prove my worth in a space where my contributions were acknowledged and valued. I started taking on more responsibilities, leading teams, and actually excelling in my role as a marketing manager. The positive feedback and the sense of accomplishment were a stark contrast to the emotional void at home. Unbeknownst to Sarah, I was building a separate emotional and intellectual life for myself within the confines of our shared existence. I was finding validation and fulfillment in areas outside of our marriage, and while it offered a temporary sense of solace, it also created a growing chasm between us. We were living parallel lives under the same roof, our emotional landscapes diverging further with each passing day. As I became more self-assured and less emotionally dependent on the validation from my marriage, the dynamic with Sarah subtly began to shift. This became particularly noticeable after she unexpectedly lost her job. The confident pronouncements about dictating intimacy seemed to waver slightly. There were more frequent, almost tentative, attempts to initiate physical contact. But by then, the emotional damage had been done. The constant rejection had eroded my desire and replaced it with a sense of weary resignation. The intimacy felt transactional, almost like she was trying to reassert some form of control in a life that suddenly felt less stable for her. It no longer felt like an expression of love or connection, but more like a strategic maneuver. The genuine desire on my part had withered, replaced by a cold sense of obligation. I started meticulously documenting the stark absence of mutual intimacy, the one-sided and often dismissive conversations, the palpable emotional distance that had solidified between us. It wasn't out of malice, but out of a growing realization that this was not a sustainable or healthy way to live. I needed evidence, not for a dramatic confrontation, but for my own clarity and for the inevitable legal proceedings I knew were looming. The decision to consult a lawyer wasn't taken lightly. It felt like admitting defeat, like acknowledging the irreversible breakdown of something I had once cherished. But the alternative, continuing to live in a state of emotional deprivation and constant rejection, felt even more unbearable. The initial consultation was a sobering experience, laying bare the legal realities of a marriage that had become a hollow shell. The day I finally told Sarah I wanted a divorce was strangely anticlimactic. There was an initial outburst of anger, accusations of me being selfish, of abandoning her during a difficult time. But beneath the anger, I saw a flicker of something else, perhaps a dawning realization that her rigid stance had consequences, that her refusal to compromise had finally pushed me past my breaking point. In the end, she didn't fight it much. Maybe, on some level, she understood that we were already over, that the I dictate rule had built an insurmountable wall between us. The divorce proceedings were relatively straightforward, though emotionally draining. The legal paperwork felt like the official autopsy of our failed relationship. The first few months of living alone were a strange mix of profound loneliness and an unexpected sense of liberation. I had to relearn the simple act of existing without constantly navigating Sarah's ideological pronouncements and the ever-present feeling of emotional distance. I threw myself even more deeply into my photography, using it as a form of therapy and self-expression. I started actively seeking freelance opportunities, building a portfolio, and surprisingly, started earning a significant income from it. It was incredibly validating to build something meaningful and fulfilling entirely on my own terms. Then, as these stories often go, life threw me a curveball in the form of Anna. We met through a photography workshop, a shared passion that immediately created a connection. She was intelligent, empathetic, and possessed a wonderful sense of humor. Our relationship blossomed organically, built on a foundation of mutual respect, open and honest communication, and a genuine desire for each other's happiness. It was a stark and beautiful contrast to the power struggles and emotional neglect that had defined my marriage with Sarah. Intimacy with Anna is a shared experience, a mutual expression of love and connection, not a dictated event. My photography business has continued to flourish, evolving from a therapeutic hobby into a thriving career. I feel a sense of self-worth and confidence that had been slowly eroded during my marriage. I've rediscovered who I was before the constant negativity and rejection chipped away at my sense of self. Looking back, I try to approach my marriage with Sarah with a sense of understanding, even if I still grapple with the hurt and frustration. I believe her feminist beliefs, while important in their broader societal context, became distorted and weaponized within the intimate space of our relationship. It morphed from a pursuit of equality into a rigid assertion of control, and ultimately, it suffocated the very connection it was supposedly meant to exist within. I don't believe she ever truly grasped the profound impact her unilateral decisions had on my emotional well-being and on the fundamental fabric of our marriage. So, AITA for checking out? For prioritizing my own sanity and eventually choosing to leave? Perhaps some might argue that I should have persevered, that I didn't try hard enough. But after years of feeling consistently dismissed, unheard, and emotionally starved, I reached a point where self-preservation became my only viable option. I had to choose myself, even if it meant dismantling the life we had built together.